The Zephyrian Empire had ruled the galaxy for 3,000 years, their crystalline ships cutting through space like divine lightning. They called themselves the Eternal Ones, beings who had transcended mortality through technology so advanced it appeared as magic to lesser species. Their bodies were perfect amalgamations of flesh and crystal, glowing with inner light that pulsed with the rhythm of dying stars. Commander Veltar stood on the bridge of the flagship Divine Ascension, his 6 arms moving in graceful patterns as he manipulated holographic displays. The ship stretched for 50 kilometers, its hull carved from a single piece of sentient crystal that could think, feel, and reshape itself at will. Around him, his crew of enhanced beings monitored 1,000 worlds, each one paying tribute to their godlike masters. "Another species requests an audience," reported Navigation Officer Kethrim, her voice carrying harmonics that could shatter mountains. "They call themselves humans. From a small blue world in the Orion Arm." Veltar's laugh resonated through the crystal walls, causing rainbow patterns to dance across every surface. "Humans? The hairless apes who discovered fire only yesterday in cosmic terms?" He gestured dismissively, his movements leaving trails of light in the air. "What could such primitive creatures possibly want from gods?" The communication array activated, projecting the image of a middle-aged human woman wearing a simple blue uniform. She had graying hair and tired eyes, but something in her expression made Veltar pause. There was no fear, no reverence, no acknowledgement of standing before beings who could unmake solar systems with a thought. "I am Admiral Sarah Chen of the United Earth Fleet," the woman said, her voice steady and calm. "We're here to discuss the tribute demands you've placed on our colony worlds." Veltar's subordinates exchanged amused glances. The audacity was almost refreshing. "Tribute demands?" Veltar stepped forward, his massive form towering over the projection. "Child, you stand before Veltar the Eternal, breaker of worlds, sculptor of reality itself. We do not make demands. We bestow the honor of service upon lesser beings." Admiral Chen's expression didn't change. "We've reviewed your historical records. You've conquered over 10,000 species, stripped their worlds of resources, and enslaved entire civilizations. You justify this by claiming divine authority." "Claiming?" The word echoed through the bridge like thunder. Every Zephyrian present felt their crystal implants pulse with indignation. "We are divine, little human. We have existed since your ancestors were crawling through mud. We have technologies that reshape the very fabric of space and time. We have eliminated death, transcended physical limitations, and created wonders beyond your comprehension." The Admiral nodded slowly. "Impressive. But Godhood requires more than advanced technology and longevity. It requires wisdom, compassion, and responsibility to those under your care. From what we've observed, you're just very old bullies with fancy toys." Silence fell over the bridge like a physical weight. In 3 millennia, no species had ever spoken to the Eternal Ones with such casual disrespect. Veltar's subordinates waited for their commander to unleash the full might of their technological superiority, perhaps turning the humans' homeworld into a brief new star. Instead, Veltar found himself genuinely curious. "You dare insult gods to their faces. Are your entire species suicidal?" "Not suicidal," Chen replied. "Just tired of watching you hurt innocent people. We've spent the last 50 years helping refugees from your conquered worlds. We've heard their stories, seen what you do to species that resist. You may have godlike power, but you use it like petulant children." Veltar's crystals flared brighter. "You speak of resistance as if it were possible. Do you know what happened to the last species that defied us? The Korthax Federation had ships that could phase through solid matter, weapons that fired concentrated gravity, shields that bent reality itself around their hulls. They considered themselves masters of the universe." He gestured, and the air filled with holographic images of a great space battle. Hundreds of sleek alien vessels, each one a masterpiece of engineering, faced off against a single Zephyrian dreadnought. The Korthax ships opened fire first, their exotic weapons tearing at the fabric of space itself. The Zephyrian ship didn't even return fire. Instead, it began to sing. The sound was impossible, beautiful and terrible, carrying harmonics that existed in dimensions beyond normal perception. As the alien fleet watched in growing horror, their ships began to resonate with the song. Metal sang, energy weapons discharged harmlessly into space, and gravity shields collapsed as their very atoms forgot how to hold together. Within minutes, the entire Korthax armada had been reduced to glittering dust, not through violence, but through a song that convinced matter itself to return to its component particles. The survivors surrendered immediately, and their species now served as living artwork in the Eternal One's trophy gardens. That, Veltar said with quiet satisfaction, was our response to the last beings who thought themselves our equals. What makes you believe humans will fare any better? Admiral Chen had watched the holographic massacre without flinching. When it ended, she looked directly into Veltar's multifaceted eyes. Because we've already found your weakness. The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Veltar's subordinates shifted nervously, their crystal implants flickering with uncertainty. The commander himself felt something he hadn't experienced in centuries, genuine surprise. Impossible, he said, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. We have no weaknesses. We have transcended every limitation that binds lesser beings. That's exactly your weakness, Chen replied. Your arrogance. Your absolute certainty that you're superior to everyone else. It's made you predictable, and predictable enemies can be defeated. Veltar's laugh returned, but it sounded forced now. Defeated by apes who haven't even mastered interstellar travel? Your entire species couldn't build a single component of our simplest tools. You're right, Chen agreed readily. We can't match your technology. We can't live for thousands of years, reshape matter with our thoughts, or sing songs that unmake fleets. But we have something you lost a long time ago. And what might that be? Admiral Chen's tired eyes hardened into something resembling steel. The ability to learn from our mistakes. The wisdom to know when we're wrong. And the courage to stand up for what's right, even when facing impossible odds. She paused, letting her words sink in. Around the bridge, Zephyrian officers began to feel an unfamiliar sensation, doubt. For beings who had considered themselves infallible for millennia, the emotion was deeply disturbing. We know we can't beat you in a fair fight, Chen continued. So we won't fight fair. We'll use every dirty trick, every desperate gambit, every impossible strategy that your perfect minds can't predict because you've forgotten what desperation feels like. Veltar stepped closer to the projection, his massive form casting crystalline shadows. Threats, Admiral? From a species that just admitted its own inferiority? Not threats. Facts. Chen's expression remained calm, but something flickered in her eyes that made ancient, powerful beings suddenly feel small. You see, we've been studying you for 50 years. Every refugee we've helped, every survivor we've rescued, every broken world we've tried to heal has taught us something new about the mighty Eternal Ones. The holographic display shifted, showing star charts and tactical analyses that made Veltar's crystals dim with shock. The humans had mapped Zephyrian trade routes, identified key resource worlds, tracked fleet movements, and analyzed tactical patterns with a thoroughness that bordered on obsession. You always attack the same way, Chen explained, her voice taking on the tone of a professor delivering a lecture. Sunships first to shatter orbital defenses, then crystal frigates to establish orbital superiority, followed by pacification drones to subdue the population. It's elegant, efficient, and completely predictable once you know what to look for. Veltar's 6 arms moved frantically across his controls, analyzing the human data. Everything they had shown was accurate, down to the smallest tactical detail. Somehow, these primitive beings had dissected 3,000 years of military doctrine with the precision of master surgeons. Moreover, Chen continued relentlessly, your entire empire relies on quantum entanglement communication networks. Destroy the right relay stations, and entire sectors go dark. Your crystal ships are incredibly powerful, but they need rare elements that only exist on 12 worlds throughout the galaxy. Cut off those supply lines, and even gods start to feel hungry. The bridge had gone completely silent. For the first time in their long, perfect lives, the Eternal Ones were hearing someone explain exactly how their empire could be brought to its knees. The humans' analysis was so thorough, so devastatingly accurate, that several junior officers actually took steps backward from the projection. But here's the most important thing we learned, Chen said, and now her voice carried a weight that seemed to press down on everyone present. You're not gods. You're just very old beings with very advanced technology and very big egos. You can be hurt, you can be fooled, and you can be beaten. It just takes someone willing to pay the price. Veltar's voice, when he finally spoke, carried undertones of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. And you believe humans are willing to pay such a price? Admiral Chen's smile was sad, tired, and absolutely terrifying in its certainty. Commander Veltar, my species spent most of our recorded history fighting each other. We've survived ice ages, plagues, world wars, and near-extinction events. We've learned to thrive in environments that would kill most other species, and we've never, ever backed down from a fight we believed in. She leaned forward slightly, her projections seeming to grow larger and more imposing. You want to know what we're willing to sacrifice to stop you? Everything. Our ships, our worlds, our lives, our entire civilization if necessary. Because we've seen what happens to species that kneel before you, and we've decided we'd rather die free than live as slaves. The communication ended abruptly, leaving the bridge of the divine ascension in stunned silence. For long moments, none of the Eternal Ones moved or spoke. They had expected groveling, perhaps desperate bargaining, maybe even futile defiance. They had not expected to be calmly informed that their entire empire was built on a foundation of sand. Veltar's tactical officer, a being whose crystal implants pulsed with nervous energy, finally broke the silence. Commander, shall we dispatch the Third Fleet to eliminate Earth before they can act on their threats? The question hung in the air like incense in a temple. Veltar considered it, his perfect mind running through countless scenarios. In every simulation, the human homeworld burned to ash within hours of the fleet's arrival. It would be simple, clean, and final. But something in Admiral Chen's voice, some quality of absolute certainty, made him hesitate. In 3,000 years of conquest, no species had ever spoken to the Eternal Ones with such calm confidence. Even the mighty Korthax had raged and threatened before their destruction. The humans had simply stated facts and made promises. No, Veltar said finally, his voice thoughtful. These humans interest me. They claim to have found weaknesses that don't exist, threaten to fight a war they cannot win, and show no fear of beings they acknowledge as their superiors. He turned to face his crew, his crystalline features reflecting the bridge's eternal lights. I want to see what desperate creatures can accomplish when backed into a corner. His communications officer, an elegant being whose voice could harmonize with the music of dying stars, looked up from her station. Should we increase patrols in human space? Perhaps position monitoring fleets near their colony worlds? Standard procedures will suffice, Veltar replied. After all, what threat could a species of hairless apes possibly pose to gods? But, even as he spoke the words, Commander Veltar found himself remembering the look in Admiral Chen's eyes. It was the gaze of someone who had already made peace with impossible odds, someone who had counted the cost of their convictions and found them worth paying. In his 3 millennia of existence, the Eternal One had seen that expression exactly once before. It had been on his own face, long ago, when the Zephyrians had been young and desperate, fighting for survival against an enemy that seemed utterly invincible. The memory sent ripples of unease through his crystalline form, but Veltar dismissed them as irrelevant. The past was past, and the Eternal Ones had transcended such primitive concerns as doubt or fear. They were gods now, masters of reality itself. Weren't they? 6 months after their first encounter with the humans, the Zephyrian Empire began experiencing what their analysts politely termed anomalous difficulties. Ships disappeared along previously secure trade routes. Quantum communication networks suffered mysterious failures that lasted exactly long enough to disrupt military coordination. Resource convoys arrived at their destinations carrying empty containers and confused crews who swore their cargo had been intact just hours before. At first, the Eternal Ones dismissed these incidents as coincidental malfunctions. Their technology was ancient and complex, occasional glitches were to be expected. But, as the problems multiplied and spread across dozens of star systems, even the most arrogant Zephyrian commanders began to suspect deliberate sabotage. Commander Veltar stood in his flagship's war room, studying holographic displays that showed the expanding pattern of disruptions. Red markers indicated failed communications, yellow showed missing supply ships, and orange marked worlds that had gone mysteriously silent. The pattern looked random at first glance, but his enhanced mind could detect an underlying structure that made his crystal implants pulse with unease. "Status report," he commanded, his voice echoing off the chamber's living walls. Fleet Admiral Zethkol, a being whose crystalline body had been enhanced with combat modifications that turned him into a living weapon, materialized beside the central display. 17 more incidents in the past standard day. The cargo ship Eternal Prosperity vanished between the Helios Gate and Corvin Prime. The communication relay at Grid 779 suffered a cascade failure that took 3 hours to repair. And we've lost contact with the mining operation on Kepler 442b. Veltar's 6 arms moved through the holographic data, analyzing patterns and probabilities. Casualties? None reported. Every missing ship has been found drifting intact, with crews unharmed but experiencing complete memory loss of the previous 12 hours. The Kepler mining team was discovered unconscious but uninjured, with all their equipment mysteriously malfunctioning. The pattern was becoming clearer, and Veltar found it deeply disturbing. Professional saboteurs would have killed witnesses and destroyed evidence. Pirates would have stolen cargo and left wreckage. But someone was systematically disrupting Zephyrian operations while going to extraordinary lengths to avoid causing permanent harm. Analysis suggests these incidents are connected, Zethkol continued, his combat implants flickering with barely contained aggression. The mathematical probability of so many simultaneous malfunctions occurring naturally approaches zero. Veltar nodded slowly. The humans. Impossible, Zethkol's form solidified further as his disagreement manifested physically. Our sensor networks show no human ships in any of the affected systems. Their entire fleet consists of perhaps 300 vessels, all accounted for in their home system or nearby colonies. They lack both the technology and the numbers to coordinate operations across such vast distances. But Commander's crystals dimmed as he considered the implications. Then, how do you explain the pattern? Before Zethkol could respond, the chamber's communication array activated with an urgent priority signal. The image of Admiral Chen appeared in the center of the room, her expression as calm and determined as it had been 6 months earlier. "Commander Veltar," she said without preamble. "I believe you've been experiencing some technical difficulties lately." The casual admission sent shock waves through both Eternal Ones. Veltar stepped closer to the projection, his massive form casting crystalline shadows across the war room. "You admit to attacking the property of gods?" Chen's expression didn't change. "We prefer to think of it as aggressive technical support. Your empire has been running the same obsolete systems for 3,000 years. We're simply pointing out some critical vulnerabilities that need addressing." Zethkol's combat modifications activated automatically, turning his crystalline form into a weapon that could shatter planets. "You dare mock beings who could erase your entire species with a thought? Could you?" Chen asked mildly. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like a few dozen humans with basic engineering knowledge have your entire empire chasing shadows. If gods can be confused by hairless apes with wrenches, maybe the definition of godhood needs some work." The insult hung in the air like acid. For beings who had considered themselves omnipotent for millennia, being reduced to the level of confused mortals was almost incomprehensible. Veltar felt something stirring in his consciousness that he hadn't experienced since his species' early days, genuine anger. "Explain your methods," he commanded, his voice carrying harmonics that could crack stone. "How are primitive beings accomplishing what should be impossible?" Admiral Chen's smile was patient, almost pitying. "The same way primitive beings always defeat advanced civilizations, Commander. We adapted. You've been using the same tactics, the same technologies, the same strategic doctrines for 3,000 years. You've become predictable." She gestured, and the projection expanded to show detailed technical schematics that made both Eternal Ones recoil in shock. The humans had somehow obtained complete blueprints of Zephyrian technology, down to the quantum level. "Your quantum communication networks are incredibly sophisticated," Chen continued conversationally. "The entanglement cascades that link your relays operate on frequencies that most species couldn't even detect, let alone interfere with. But they all use the same base protocols, established when your empire was young and hasn't been updated since." Veltar's mind raced through the implications. The Korthax refugees, he breathed. The survivors we kept as trophies. Among others. Turns out, beings from conquered species remember quite a lot about their former captors' technology, especially when given proper medical care and a chance to process their trauma. We've been running something of an informal support group for Zephyrian refugees for the past 50 years. The revelation hit both commanders like a physical blow. The Eternal Ones had never considered that their living trophies might retain detailed knowledge of Imperial systems. Why would gods concern themselves with the memories of ants? Impossible, Zethkol snarled, his weapon systems charging with deadly energy. Our trophy beings are kept in stasis. Their minds are locked in crystalline matrices that prevent coherent thought. Chen's expression grew colder. We're kept in stasis. Until our liberation teams started breaking them out. Amazing how much gratitude you earned by freeing someone from eternal imprisonment. The war room's walls pulsed with alarm patterns as security systems detected the massive spike in emotional distress from both Eternal Ones. Veltar's perfect composure cracked for the first time in centuries, his crystalline features shifting between patterns of rage and disbelief. You've been infiltrating Imperial space for decades, he said, the words coming out like accusations. Stealing our property, subverting our systems, gathering intelligence while posing as primitive explorers. Guilty as charged, Chen replied cheerfully. Though I prefer to think of it as an extended research project. We've learned so much about your empire's structure, your weaknesses, your blind spots. Did you know that Zephyrian officers never look down? Literally. Your enhanced senses are focused on macro-scale threats, but you consistently ignore maintenance drones, service tunnels, and other mundane elements of your own infrastructure. As if to emphasize the point, soft chimes began echoing through the flagship's corridors. Veltar's tactical displays lit up with proximity alarms as his crew discovered nearly a dozen small objects attached to critical systems throughout the ship. The objects were crude by Zephyrian standards, barely more than metal boxes with simple electronics, but they had been precisely placed to disrupt key functions if activated. When? Veltar demanded, his voice shaking with fury. When did your saboteurs board my ship? About 6 months ago, Chen replied calmly. Right after our first conversation. A small maintenance drone with a human operator inside. Your security systems didn't even notice it because it was using standard Zephyrian identification codes provided by grateful refugees. The implications were staggering. If humans could infiltrate the flagship of the Eternal Ones without detection, no Zephyrian vessel was safe. Veltar's mind raced through memories of the past months, wondering how many other ships had been compromised, how many systems had been studied and mapped by invisible enemies. You begin to understand, Chen observed, watching the play of emotions across the commander's crystalline features. Your empire is vast and powerful, but it's also incredibly complex. Complex systems have failure points, and we've spent 50 years learning to exploit everyone we can find. Zethkol's weapons finally reached full charge, turning him into a living engine of destruction. Enough words. Let us demonstrate what happens to mortals who threaten gods. His form exploded with deadly light as concentrated energy beams lanced toward the projection, weapons powerful enough to punch through the hulls of battleships. The beams passed harmlessly through Admiral Chen's image and struck the war room's far wall, leaving glowing scars in the crystalline structure. Chen didn't even flinch. Feel better? Because that's exactly the kind of thinking that's going to lose you this war. What war? Veltar demanded. You have 300 ships against an empire that spans half the galaxy. You admit to using sabotage and infiltration because you cannot face us in open battle. What manner of war can you possibly hope to fight? Admiral Chen's expression grew deadly serious. The kind of war your people have forgotten how to fight. A war where victory goes to whoever can adapt fastest, learn quickest, and sacrifice most. You've been gods for so long that you've forgotten what it's like to struggle, to fail, to get back up and try again. She leaned forward, her projections seeming to grow larger and more imposing. But we remember. Every human alive today is descended from ancestors who survived ice ages, famines, plagues, and countless wars. We carry the genetic memory of species that learned to thrive in the face of impossible odds. The communication array flickered, and Admiral Chen's image began to fade. "The devices we've planted on your ship aren't weapons, Commander. They're gifts. Study them, learn from them, understand what you're really facing. Because this was just the beginning." Her final words echoed through the war room long after the projection had ended. "We're coming for your empire, one system at a time. And we're bringing every species you've ever conquered with us." Silence fell over the chamber like a shroud. Veltar and Zethkol stared at the empty space where the human admiral had been, their perfect minds struggling to process the magnitude of what they'd just learned. "Orders, Commander?" Zethkol asked finally, his weapons still charged but his voice uncertain. Veltar turned to study the tactical displays showing the spreading pattern of disruptions across their empire. Each red marker represented another small victory for beings who shouldn't have been able to challenge gods. Each yellow symbol marked another lesson learned by enemies who adapted faster than their supposed superiors. "Summon the High Council," he said at last, his voice carrying none of its usual confidence. "All fleets are to return to defensive positions around core worlds. And send word to every sector command, the Empire is at war." Zethkol's crystalline form flickered with surprise. "War? Against a species of primitives?" Veltar looked at his subordinate with eyes that had seen the rise and fall of civilizations, eyes that now carried the bitter taste of uncertainty. "No," he said quietly. "War against beings who remember how to fight like mortals. And that may be the most dangerous enemy the Eternal Ones have ever faced." As alerts began echoing through the flagship's corridors and emergency protocols activated throughout the Empire, Veltar found himself remembering Admiral Chen's words about adaptation and sacrifice. For 3,000 years, the Zephyrians had been unchanging, perfect, eternal. They had forgotten that survival sometimes required transformation. Now, as reports flooded in of coordinated strikes across dozens of systems, as refugee populations on Zephyrian trophy worlds began staging simultaneous uprisings, as the humans and their allies demonstrated tactics that turned the Empire's own complexity against itself, Veltar began to understand the true magnitude of their mistake. They had become gods by transcending mortality. But their enemies were winning by embracing it. The war that followed was unlike anything in the recorded history of the galaxy. For 2 years, the Zephyrian Empire found itself fighting an enemy that refused to behave like a traditional opponent. The humans and their growing coalition of liberated species avoided direct confrontation, instead striking at infrastructure, supply lines, and communication networks with surgical precision. Commander Veltar stood in what remained of his flagship's command center, surrounded by crystalline walls scarred by countless emergency repairs. The Divine Ascension had been attacked 17 times in the past 6 months, not by enemy fleets but by single operatives who somehow infiltrated the ship's defenses, sabotaged critical systems, and vanished before security could respond. The bridge crew moved with nervous efficiency, their perfect forms showing stress patterns that would have been unthinkable just years before. Several positions stood empty, their former occupants having requested transfers to safer assignments after psychological breakdowns that the Eternal Ones weren't supposed to be capable of experiencing. "Status report," Veltar commanded, his voice carrying undertones of exhaustion that crystalline beings weren't supposed to feel. Fleet Admiral Zethkol materialized beside the tactical display, his combat modifications now permanently active in response to constant threat assessments. "The Third Fleet has lost another supply convoy to unknown attackers. The Zirian shipyards report that 3 more construction platforms have been disabled by infiltrator teams. And we've received surrender documents from the Altair system." The last item struck Veltar like a physical blow. The Altair system contained 5 worlds that had been part of the Empire for over a millennium. Their sudden defection meant losing billions of subjects and vast industrial resources. Surrender to whom? Veltar asked, though he already knew the answer. "The United Liberation Front," Zethkol replied grimly. "The coalition claims to represent over 40 species, all former Zephyrian subjects who have joined the human rebellion." Veltar studied the strategic displays with growing frustration. Red zones marked systems lost to the rebellion, yellow indicated areas under enemy influence, and green showed regions still under Imperial control. The green areas were shrinking daily, not through military conquest but through voluntary defection. "How many ships did we lose retaking the vegan colonies?" he asked. None, Zethkol admitted reluctantly. The colonies were evacuated before our forces arrived. Intelligence suggests the entire population was relocated to mobile habitats operating in interstellar space. The admission highlighted the rebels' most frustrating tactic. Instead of defending fixed positions, they had embraced mobility, creating vast fleets of converted civilian ships, mobile factories, and hidden bases scattered throughout the void between stars. The Zephyrians could destroy any target they could find, but finding targets had become nearly impossible. And our attempt to trace their supply networks? Zethkol's form flickered with embarrassment. The tracking devices were discovered within hours and turned into recruitment propaganda. The enemy broadcast footage of Zephyrian spy technology being dismantled by smiling children while their parents explained how the Eternal Ones were so desperate that they had resorted to secretly tagging refugee supplies. Veltar's crystals dimmed with humiliation. The empire that had once struck fear into the hearts of galaxies was now being mocked by beings they had considered beneath notice. Worse, the mockery was having effect. Several imperial worlds had begun questioning whether gods who needed to resort to such tactics deserved their worship. Sir, called Communications Officer Lysandra from her station, were receiving an urgent transmission from High Command. Priority Alpha. The central display shimmered and resolved into the image of Supreme Overlord Kethmarin, eldest of the Eternal Ones and ruler of the Zephyrian Empire for over 2 millennia. His crystalline form blazed with power that could reshape reality, but, even through the projection, Veltar could sense an undercurrent of strain. Commander Veltar, the Supreme Overlord began without preamble, you will immediately redirect your forces to the Centauri sector. The humans have launched their most audacious assault yet. Veltar's tactical systems activated, displaying intelligence reports that made his enhanced mind reel with disbelief. The humans hadn't attacked a minor outpost or supply convoy. They had struck at the heart of the Empire itself. They've seized the Nexus, Kethmarin continued, his voice carrying harmonics of barely controlled rage. Somehow, these primitives have captured the central communication hub that coordinates our entire quantum network. The implications were staggering. The Nexus was more than just a communication relay, it was the nervous system of the Zephyrian Empire. Every military order, every administrative directive, every piece of data that flowed between star systems passed through its quantum processors. In enemy hands, it would provide unprecedented insight into Imperial operations. How is that possible? Veltar asked. The Nexus is located in an artificial dimension, accessible only through gates that require divine-level consciousness to operate. They didn't use the gates, Kethmarin's image flickered with frustrated energy. According to our sensors, the attack came from within the Nexus itself. Somehow, the humans were already inside when they revealed themselves. Veltar felt something cold settle in his crystalline core. Inside how long? Unknown. Possibly months, perhaps years. They may have been observing our entire command structure since the beginning of this conflict. The revelation sent shock waves through the bridge crew. If humans had been monitoring Imperial communications, they would know about every planned operation, every strategic decision, every tactical deployment before the orders were even issued. What are their demands? Zethkol asked, his combat systems charging automatically. They're not making demands, Kethmarin replied grimly. They're making an offer. The Supreme Overlord's image expanded to include Admiral Chan, who appeared to be standing in the Nexus's control chamber surrounded by impossible technology that hurt to look at directly. She seemed small and fragile next to the reality warping machinery, but her expression carried the same calm certainty that had marked their first encounter. Commander Veltar, she said, nodding politely as if greeting an old acquaintance. I hope you've been well. We've certainly learned a lot from monitoring your communications over the past 18 months. The casual admission of surveillance sent fresh waves of outrage through the bridge crew. Veltar himself felt his perfect composure finally crack completely, his crystalline features shifting through patterns of fury and humiliation. What do you want? He demanded, his voice shaking with emotions that gods weren't supposed to experience. What I've always wanted, Chen replied simply. An end to the suffering you've caused. A chance for the thousands of species you've conquered to reclaim their freedom. And an opportunity for your people to remember what they were before they decided they were gods. She gestured toward the Nexus machinery, and the display showed incredible complexity even by Zephyrian standards. This is amazing technology, by the way. It operates on principles that we're only beginning to understand. The quantum processing alone represents advances that would take human science centuries to duplicate. Veltar found himself genuinely confused by her tone. You admit our technological superiority? Absolutely. But, here's what I've learned about advanced technology over the past few years: it's only as reliable as the beings who operate it. Chen moved to a control console, her small hands dancing over interfaces designed for six-armed crystalline entities. This entire system depends on quantum entanglement networks that span the galaxy. Incredibly sophisticated, virtually unhackable, completely reliable. Her smile was patient and slightly sad. Unless someone changes the base quantum frequencies by 0.001%. Then, the whole thing starts singing like a broken violin. As if to demonstrate, she made a minute adjustment to one of the control settings. Immediately, the Nexus began producing harmonics that sent feedback through every quantum relay in the Empire. On the Divine Ascension S-Bridge, communication systems sparked and went offline, tactical displays flickered with false information, and even the ship's crystalline hull began resonating with discordant vibrations. Stop! Kethmarin commanded, his voice carrying enough power to shatter moons. You're disrupting the entire Imperial network. Chen's hand paused over the controls. I'm demonstrating vulnerability. Your entire empire runs on systems that are incredibly advanced but completely inflexible. Change one small parameter, introduce one unexpected variable, and everything stops working. She restored the original settings, and the harmonic distortion faded. Throughout the empire, communication systems came back online and tactical networks resumed normal operation. But the demonstration had made its point. The humans now controlled the nervous system that kept the Zephyrian Empire functioning. This is our offer, Admiral Chen continued, turning to face both Supreme Overlord and Commander directly. Voluntary dissolution of the Empire. You release all conquered species, return stolen resources where possible, and allow your former subjects to govern themselves. In exchange, we guarantee safe passage to any Zephyrian world or colony where your people want to live in peace. Kethmarin's crystalline form blazed with outrage. You expect gods to negotiate with mortals? To surrender an empire built over 3 millennia? I expect intelligent beings to recognize reality, Chen replied calmly. Your empire is collapsing. You've lost 40% of your territory in 2 years, your military is demoralized, and your population is beginning to question whether eternal rule by distant gods is worth the cost. You can fight this war until your civilization destroys itself, or you can choose a peaceful transition that preserves what's worth preserving. Veltar studied the tactical displays with new understanding. The pattern of lost systems, failed operations, and successful rebel actions now made terrible sense. The humans hadn't been fighting to conquer the Zephyrian Empire, they had been teaching it to conquer itself. You've been planning this from the beginning, he realized. Not just the military campaign, but the political consequences. You knew we would respond to sabotage with increasing authoritarianism, that our subjects would begin questioning our authority when they saw gods acting desperate. Chen nodded approvingly. Every species reacts predictably to prolonged stress. Even gods, apparently. The more pressure we applied, the more rigid and paranoid your responses became. Eventually, your own people started asking whether beings who could be confused and frustrated by primitive apes really deserved worship. The truth of it hit Veltar like a quantum torpedo. The rebels hadn't won through superior technology or military might. They had won by proving that the Eternal Ones were neither eternal nor divine. They were just very old beings with very advanced tools, and tools could break, could be stolen, could be turned against their users. You have one standard day to consider our offer, Chen continued. After that, we begin broadcasting the complete records of Imperial communications that we've been collecting. Every order to massacre civilian populations, every decision to enslave entire species, every casual conversation about treating sentient beings as property. Let your subjects decide for themselves whether they want to continue serving gods who see them as toys. The threat was elegant in its simplicity. The Zephyrian Empire ruled through a combination of fear and religious awe. But, if their subjects learned that their gods were capable of petty vindictiveness, casual cruelty, and fundamental uncertainty, the entire ideological foundation of imperial rule would crumble overnight. "And, if we refuse?" Cathmarin asked, though his voice had lost much of its earlier authority. Admiral Chen's expression grew infinitely sad. "Then, we'll do what we have to do. We'll broadcast everything, shut down your communications, disable your ships, and let the galaxy decide what to do with beings who claimed godhood but acted like tyrants. It won't be pretty, and it won't be quick, but it will be final." She paused, looking directly into Veltar's multifaceted eyes. "But I hope it doesn't come to that. Your people were once explorers and builders, creators of wonders that enriched the galaxy. They could be that again, if they chose to remember what they were before they decided what they deserved to become." The transmission ended, leaving the bridge of the Divine Ascension in profound silence. Around the command center, the most advanced beings in known space stared at displays and instruments, trying to process the impossible reality of their situation. "Orders, Supreme Overlord?" Zethkol asked finally, his weapons systems still charging but his voice uncertain. Cathmarin's image flickered with patterns of light that had no names, emotions that transcended normal understanding. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of millennia and the bitter taste of wisdom acquired too late. "Convene the High Council," he said quietly. "It appears we have much to discuss." As emergency signals began echoing throughout the Empire and ancient beings prepared to make decisions they had never thought they would face, Veltar found himself remembering Admiral Chen's final words. She had seen potential in beings who had forgotten their own nature, hope for a species that had lost its way in pursuit of power. Perhaps, he thought as he watched his perfect empire crumbling around him, godhood had never been about transcending mortality. Perhaps it had been about accepting responsibility for the consequences of one's actions, about using power to lift others up rather than hold them down. Perhaps they had been gods once, long ago, when they had built rather than conquered, when they had explored rather than dominated, when they had remembered that true strength came from protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. And, perhaps, if they were very careful and very lucky, they could learn to be gods again. The Zephyrian Empire formally surrendered 18 hours later. The ceremony was broadcast throughout the galaxy, showing beings who had called themselves eternal kneeling before representatives of the species they had oppressed. It was the end of one age and the beginning of another. But it was also, in its way, a kind of rebirth.